There are moments in history when a whisper breaks through the silence and everything changes. Not because new evidence is discovered or because history is rewritten, but because a dying breath carries with it a truth too heavy to carry into the grave. This is the story of those whispers. 10 deathbed confessions that upended families, shattered illusions, and forced entire societies to confront uncomfortable truths. As the final days close in and the distractions of ambition, pride, or fear lose their grip, something strange often happens. The truth comes calling. For some, it's a burden they've carried for decades, a lie they told, a secret they kept, a wrong they helped to cover. And as the body weakens, the weight of silence becomes unbearable. In quiet hospital rooms, modest living rooms, and anonymous nursing homes, ordinary people have made extraordinary confessions. Some were former officials who'd helped bury the truth under layers of bureaucracy. Others were nurses, engineers, or parents who had simply chosen silence over scandal. But on their deathbeds, with time running out, they made a different choice. They chose to speak. What compels a person to speak just before the end? Some say it's guilt, that moral reckoning when there's nothing left to lose. Others believe it's a final attempt at redemption, not for public recognition, but for peace. To finally lay down the burden of a truth long hidden. In the next chapters, we'll journey through 12 such stories. Some are intimate, reshaping the lives of a few. Others ripple outward, altering entire historical narratives. An assassination that wasn't what it seemed. A baby switched at birth. A long-lost child never truly gone. Corporate negligence masked as tragedy. Each tale begins the same, with someone dying. But where they end takes us far from where we began. These stories are not just about secrets. They're about the human cost of silence, the fragility of memory, and the consequences of choosing comfort over truth. They show us how the past never really dies. It just waits, quietly, for the moment someone finally decides to tell it. And as we begin, keep this in mind. For every deathbed confession that surfaces, there are countless more that vanish into the dark, never spoken, never known. So perhaps the real question isn't what these people finally revealed, but what remains buried still. This is part 1 of our story. The prologue to a journey into the final truths of lives that changed history, one whispered confession at a time. The room was dimly lit, humming with the low rhythm of a heart monitor. It was 1989, and a man in his 70s lay in a hospital bed, worn thin by cancer and time. He had served his country for decades, deep within the corridors of intelligence work, a mid-level officer, invisible to the public, but present at moments that shaped the nation. Now, with death only weeks away, he asked for a journalist. What he revealed unraveled the most accepted version of one of America's darkest moments, the assassination of a president. The official story, etched in textbooks and documentaries, insisted a lone gunman had acted alone. But this man's confession told a different story. A story of meetings held behind locked doors, of maps marked with routes, timing, and escape plans, of collaboration between shadowy agencies and organized crime. He hadn't pulled a trigger himself. That task, he said, fell to professionals. But he had been there, in the planning rooms, watching the puzzle pieces come together with chilling precision. The confession was rich in detail, names of agents, times of meetings, coded language used over secure lines. He even described how the cover-up was orchestrated, how witnesses were silenced or discredited, and how evidence was destroyed or replaced before the publics ever got close. The man claimed there were at least 3 shooters stationed at different vantage points. His version made sense of decades of confusion. The conflicting eyewitness accounts, the strange ballistic trajectories, the sense among many that something didn't add up. He explained how they manipulated the autopsy, how key photographs simply disappeared, and how the story was shaped to protect the machinery behind it all. After his death, the journalist published the confession. Predictably, it was dismissed by officials. They called it the fantasy of a dying man. But something in the confession resonated. Scholars and independent researchers, long frustrated by the inconsistencies in the official record, recognized the significance of his details. Things the public could never have known. Things that matched newly declassified files and forgotten testimonies. The confession didn't offer a tidy conclusion. It didn't name the mastermind or explain every shadow. But it cracked open the narrative. It forced people to reconsider what had long been accepted. More importantly, it gave a voice to those who had always suspected there was more to the story. And yet, the man had waited 40 years, decades of silence as the country debated and doubted. He'd watched documentaries and news specials explaining away the inconsistencies, each one another stone on his chest. Fear had kept him quiet. Fear for his family. Fear of retaliation. But in the final stretch of life, he chose to trade fear for truth. It didn't bring justice. It didn't lead to a courtroom reckoning. But it offered something else. A reason to look again. To listen more carefully. To question what we think we know. And in that quiet hospital room, the weight of a nation's doubt found a voice in one man's final truth. A voice that still echoes, asking whether history is ever as simple as the stories we're told. It was a rainy afternoon in 1998 when a 78-year-old woman, frail and fading fast, called her daughter to her bedside. Her voice trembled, not just from age or illness, but from the unbearable weight of something she'd hidden for over half a century. What she was about to reveal would tear open the foundations of two families' lives. She had once been a nurse, just 22 years old in 1947, working the night shift in a bustling maternity ward. That night had been a blur. Too many births, not enough hands, and exhaustion clouding her mind after a double shift. Amid the chaos, she had taken two newborns for routine checks. When she returned them to their bassinets, she unknowingly swapped their identification bracelets. She realized her mistake hours later when she saw the mothers holding the wrong babies. The differences were subtle, a nose slightly longer, a different tone in their cries. But they were there. And in that moment, she froze. Panic set in. To admit the mistake would risk her job, her future, perhaps even criminal charges. So she said nothing. For 50 years, she kept her silence. But she never stopped watching. Quietly, she followed both children as they grew, reading the local news, checking public records, clinging to every detail. One child had grown up in a wealthy home, attending elite schools, traveling the world. The other had lived modestly, scraping by, yet surrounded by warmth and love. As her life neared its end, the guilt became unbearable. She confessed everything to her daughter, the names, the hospital, the date, and the switch. After her death, the daughter contacted both families. The reaction was disbelief and anger, but DNA testing left no doubt. The two men, now in their 50s, had been raised by families they weren't biologically connected to. The aftermath was like stepping into a dream where nothing felt real. Each man had to reconcile not only with a new identity, but with the life that might have been. One now saw the privileges he'd received as belonging to someone else. The other questioned what had been taken from him. Opportunities, security, perhaps even happiness. Reunions followed, but they were complicated. One man embraced his biological family, forming new bonds with people who felt both familiar and foreign. The other kept his distance, unable to fully accept a truth that undermined everything he had known. The nurse's confession changed more than the lives of the two switched babies. It affected their siblings, their parents, their children. It exposed how fragile the idea of identity can be. That we are shaped not just by blood, but by the love we receive and the names we grow into. And it raised haunting questions. What if the mistake had never been revealed? Was it better to live in a lie that brought peace, or a truth that brought pain? In the end, the answer wasn't simple. But for one dying nurse, the answer had become clear. She could no longer carry the secret. She chose to tell the truth, even if it arrived too late to heal. In doing so, she reminded us that the line between accident and fate is often thinner than we think, and sometimes the smallest mistake can echo through generations. It was the kind of confession that could only come at the end of a life. In 2003, a former police detective, once respected, now aged and ravaged by emphysema, reached out to an attorney. With each shallow breath, he edged closer to a truth that had haunted him for a quarter of a century, and what he revealed would tear through families and institutions alike. 25 years earlier, he had taken the witness stand and told a lie that sent an innocent man to death row, a lie that led to execution. At the time, the case had been high profile, a brutal murder in an affluent neighborhood, the kind that draws headlines and public outrage. Pressure from the mayor's office had trickled down like rain, solved the case, eased the panic, delivered justice. But justice didn't come, not truly. The real suspect, the victim's business partner, had the means, the motive, and connections. Expensive lawyers, political ties, and an alibi woven from influence. The detective had proposed investigating him. He was told to focus on a more convenient suspect, a working-class man with a minor record and no resources to fight back. The confession had been coerced, evidence planted, witnesses coached, and the jury, unaware of the manipulation behind the scenes, returned a guilty verdict. Years later, the man was executed, his final words proclaiming his innocence. The detective never forgot. He watched the execution on television, saw the face of the man he helped convict, and then he carried the weight of that act through the decades that followed. Each promotion, each award, each time he tucked his children into bed, always shadowed by that one irreversible decision. Now, with his body failing and no future left to protect, he chose truth. His statement was detailed and damning. It included internal memos, descriptions of the planted evidence, and the pressure from his superiors to close the case quickly, cleanly, and quietly. It named names, and including the business partner who, now in his 70s, was still free. The fallout was swift. The confession triggered an investigation that unearthed the corruption buried beneath the conviction. It wasn't just one rogue officer. It was an entire system that had chosen convenience over justice. Eventually, when confronted with the evidence, the real killer confessed. He was arrested and charged decades after his crime, but the damage couldn't be undone. A man had been executed. A family had mourned. And vindication, when it came, felt more like salt than healing. The detective's confession led to policy reviews and debates about the death penalty. It reignited the question: how many others had been lost to silence and systemic failure? In his final weeks, the detective found no comfort in being believed. There were no headlines calling him a hero for telling the truth. But perhaps in that hospital room, surrounded by legal papers and regret, he had finally stopped lying, not to the world, but to himself. His story was a reminder that justice delayed may be justice denied, but justice buried by silence is a tragedy shared by all. And that sometimes the most important truths arrive too late, to save a life, but just in time to shake a system awake. It began with the faint hum of a ventilator and a man unable to speak above a whisper. In 2007, a retired chemical engineer, gripped by the final stages of ALS, invited a team of environmental lawyers into his home. What he shared with them was not just a confession. It was an indictment of an industry, a corporation, and a culture of profit over human life. 30 years earlier, in 1977, a catastrophic explosion at a chemical plant had killed over 300 people instantly. Thousands more were exposed to a toxic cloud that lingered over the nearby town, leaving a legacy of cancers, birth defects, and respiratory illnesses. The official explanation was clear-cut: unexpected equipment failure, a tragic accident. But the engineer had always known better. Back then, he had overseen safety systems at the plant. 6 months before the explosion, he and his team had warned upper management. The pressure release systems were failing. The aging infrastructure, pushed beyond its limits by increasing production demands, was one faulty seal away from disaster. They needed upgrades, expensive ones, but management said no. Profit margins came first. The warnings were ignored, and the engineers were told to make do, or make way. So the plant continued operating at full capacity, with critical safety systems already on the verge of collapse. And then the day came. One rupture, one leak, and everything went up in fire and poison. Afterward, the company sprang into action, not to make things right, but to cover their tracks. They hired experts to testify that the disaster couldn't have been foreseen. They paid off victims' families quietly, discouraged investigations, and warned employees not to speak out. The engineer, silenced by confidentiality agreements and implicit threats, kept quiet. But the truth never left him. For 3 decades, he watched the aftermath unfold. He saw news specials blaming faulty valves, heard executives on television insisting it was all unforeseeable. Meanwhile, the sicknesses in the community mounted. He kept boxes of documents, internal emails, maintenance records, memos hidden in his basement. Proof of what had really happened. Now, with his body failing him and time measured in weeks, he couldn't stay silent any longer. He handed over everything to the lawyers, and when they went public, the revelation cracked the story wide open. The disaster hadn't been an act of God or fate. It was the predictable result of negligence, greed, and silence. Lawsuits were reopened. Criminal investigations launched. The company, already rebranded and merged, was forced to face the past it had tried to bury. Survivors and families of the dead learned that their loved ones hadn't died because of a fluke. They'd been sacrificed on the altar of quarterly earnings. The engineer didn't live to see the trials. He passed away quietly, knowing the truth was no longer hidden. Some called him brave. Others questioned why he'd waited so long. But perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps the better one is, what kind of world makes a man so afraid to speak the truth that he waits until his final breath to do it? In the end, his confession didn't undo the pain, but it forced a reckoning. And in doing so, he offered something rare: clarity in the fog of tragedy, and a chance, however late, for accountability. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of machines and the distant murmur of a TV left on for comfort. In 2012, a successful businessman lay dying of pancreatic cancer. He had built a life of wealth, status, and stability. But beneath that carefully constructed world, he had hidden something, or rather, someone, actually, a whole family. As his final days approached, he called his wife and children to his bedside. His voice, once commanding in boardrooms and social clubs, was now brittle, but the words he spoke would fracture everything they believed about him. For 35 years, he had maintained a second life. Another woman, other children, a parallel existence hidden in another city, nurtured in secrecy. It had begun in the early 1970s. He'd met her on a business trip, an affair at first, impulsive, fueled by dissatisfaction and escape. But then she became pregnant. Rather than leave his family or abandon her, he made a different choice. He chose both. He built a business that required frequent travel, the perfect cover for a double life. 2 households, 2 sets of birthdays, 2 versions of himself. His official family believed he was on the road tirelessly growing the company. His second family thought he was a divorced father who split time between cities. He kept everything separate: bank accounts, phones, even holidays. For decades, he lived with the constant pressure of managing lies. Now, with death drawing near, he realized those lies would unravel during the estate process. So he chose to reveal them himself. He looked into the eyes of his wife and children, the ones he had built his public life with, and told them the truth. Shock turned to devastation. His wife, with whom he had shared a home and memories, felt her entire marriage had been a carefully curated illusion. His children reeled at the thought that they had siblings, strangers, born of betrayal. When the second family was told, their reaction was no less painful. What they had believed was a devoted, if complicated, love story was in fact the result of deception. The fallout was messy. Legal battles over inheritance erupted. Was the second wife legally entitled to anything? Did her children have a right to a share of the estate? More painfully, emotional fractures widened. Attempts to bring the two families together failed. The resentment was too deep, the sense of betrayal too raw. The businessman died 2 months after his confession. No funeral united the people he had called family. In the end, he was buried without ceremony, mourned by no one. The man who tried to split his life down the middle died caught between two halves, and neither wanted the whole. Some wondered whether the confession had been worth it. Would it have been kinder to stay silent, to let both families remember him in peace, even if it meant preserving a lie? Others argued that truth, however painful, is a final act of integrity. But truth doesn't always heal. Sometimes it simply uncovers what was always broken. In this case, it did not redeem the man, but it revealed the cost of living a life in halves. And it left everyone who loved him wondering if they had ever known him at all. The man was nearing 80, his heart failing fast. But it wasn't the pain of his body that made him reach out. It was the weight of memory. In 2001, he contacted a human rights group with a confession he had buried for 6 decades. He was a veteran of World War II, and he had something to say. Not about bravery or survival, but about something far darker, something shameful. He spoke of a village, nameless now, once nestled in the countryside of occupied territory. It was 1942. His unit had been told the village was sheltering resistance fighters. The order came down, direct and cold. Eliminate the threat. Send a message. The village was to be made an example. So they surrounded it, rounded up everyone, the men, women, children, the elderly. No one resisted. They were confused, frightened. And then came the unthinkable, the execution order. The soldiers obeyed, because they had been told to, because disobedience meant punishment, because in war, humanity is often the first casualty. The bodies were buried in mass graves. The village was set ablaze, turned to ash. And the official report? It claimed enemy action, a firefight, collateral damage in the chaos of war. The truth was erased before it had a chance to be written, but it hadn't been erased from him. He remembered every face, every scream, every moment he chose not to refuse the command. For 60 years he lived with it, telling no one, not his wife, not his children. Until the guilt became louder than the silence, he gave names, locations, dates, the officers who gave the orders, fellow soldiers who had pulled the trigger beside him. He didn't hide his own role. He had followed orders, yes, but he hadn't resisted. That haunted him more than anything. The human rights organization took the confession seriously. They combed through military records, old maps, and war archives. Using ground-penetrating radar, they found anomalies beneath the earth where the man said they would. Excavations confirmed it. Mass graves. Bodies of men, women, and children. Most had died from gunshots. All had been unarmed. The revelation didn't make headlines at first. The military downplayed it, calling it an isolated tragedy, but the evidence spoke louder. Survivors from nearby villages, now elderly, stepped forward. They had known, whispered stories passed through generations, but had never been believed. Now, finally, they were. The veteran died not long after giving his testimony. There were no criminal trials. Most of the officers involved were already dead. But there was something else, something quieter but powerful: acknowledgement. For the families of the dead, for the history books, for the conscience of a nation. The man's confession didn't undo the atrocity. It didn't restore the village or bring back the lost lives, but it pierced through a lie that had stood for 60 years. And in doing so, it reminded us that the stories of war are rarely as clean or noble as we want to believe. In the silence that followed his words, there was grief. But also, perhaps, a kind of justice, not legal, but moral, because sometimes the truth isn't about punishment. It's about refusing to let the lie be the last word. She was 68, battling cancer, and nearing the end of a life lived in quiet contradiction. In 2014, she contacted the FBI with a story that would unravel one of the country's most haunting mysteries: the disappearance of a newborn baby in 1969. The case had gone cold decades ago. Most believed the child had been taken by a stranger, likely killed. But the truth was far more complex. She was that stranger, the woman who had stolen the baby. Back then, she was a young woman in the throes of despair. Multiple miscarriages had shattered her emotionally. She felt like her body had betrayed her. As her grief festered, it became obsession, a fixation that blurred the lines of right and wrong. One day, dressed in a nurse's uniform, she walked into a hospital nursery. With practiced calm, she picked up a baby girl and walked out. No one stopped her. No one suspected. The child's real parents were left in devastation, their lives splintered by grief, their hopes slowly worn down by time. The kidnapper moved to another state, changed her name, and forged a birth certificate. She raised the baby as her own. She was, by all accounts, a loving mother. Attentive, supportive. Her daughter grew up unaware, living a normal life: school, friends, marriage, children. A life built on a lie. But the lie never left the woman who created it. Every birthday reminded her of the parents she had robbed. Every graduation, every holiday carried the shadow of a stolen past. She watched her daughter grow, haunted by the knowledge that she was never truly hers. As her illness progressed and the end drew near, she could no longer live with the silence. She reached out to the authorities and confessed everything. The details were chilling in their precision. Dates, times, hospital layout, even the exact moment she decided to take the child. DNA testing confirmed what she had said. The 45-year-old woman she had raised was, in fact, the long-lost baby. The impact was seismic. The stolen woman's entire identity crumbled in an instant. The woman she had called Mom was her abductor. The family she had never known still lived. Parents who had grieved her, siblings who had wondered about her every day. And yet it wasn't simple. Her kidnapper had been a good mother, not perfect, but deeply loving. The crime was real. The love was real. And now she was caught between two versions of herself: the daughter who had been stolen and the woman who had been raised with kindness. The reunion with her biological family was emotionally charged. There were tears and awkward smiles, moments of connection clouded by decades of absence. Her parents had never given up hope. Now they held her again, but the years couldn't be reclaimed. The kidnapper died just weeks after confessing. No trial, no legal reckoning. Just a quiet end to a life built on a single, irreversible act. The woman she raised would spend years grappling with the question of how to remember her, as a criminal or as the only mother she had ever known. Some stories defy resolution. This was one of them. It showed how love and harm can exist in the same space, and how even the most well-intentioned lies carry consequences that never truly fade. The confession reunited a family, but it also tore one apart. The man's voice was weak, but steady. In 2009, dying of liver failure, he requested a meeting with medical ethics investigators. What he revealed would unearth one of the darkest chapters in modern psychiatric care. It wasn't about misdiagnoses or outdated treatments. It was about experiments, unauthorized, unethical, and hidden for decades. Back in the 1970s, he had been a young psychiatrist working at a large state-run mental institution. The era was different. Patient rights were minimal, oversight almost non-existent. In that environment, he saw opportunity, not for healing, but for experimentation. He believed he could pioneer new treatments, push the boundaries of psychiatric medicine. But instead of following research protocols, he bypassed them entirely. Patients were subjected to experimental drug combinations, sometimes at dangerously high doses. They never consented. Many were nonverbal or too cognitively impaired to understand what was happening. Some suffered seizures. Others experienced permanent neurological damage. A few died, their deaths quietly attributed to their mental illnesses. He falsified records, changed dosages in files, removed any mention of side effects that might draw suspicion. It became routine, and he wasn't alone. As he later confessed, several other doctors engaged in similar practices. The institution turned a blind eye. After all, the patients weren't going anywhere, and few families ever questioned the outcomes. Eventually, tighter regulations came. Oversight increased. The secret experiments stopped. He moved on to a prestigious hospital and built a reputable career, but the past followed him. The faces of the patients, some frightened, some confused, some unable to protest, haunted him. Every award he received felt like a lie. Now, as his body failed him, he finally told the truth. He handed over pages of notes, old records, and recollections of the drugs used and the patients harmed. Investigators were stunned. When they contacted the former institution, the walls of silence began to crack. More records emerged, more names, and yes, more doctors. The team began tracking down families of former patients. Many had died, but some were still alive. Men and women who had lived for decades with unexplained cognitive impairments, chronic seizures, or emotional trauma. For those families, the confession was a bitter gift. They finally understood what had happened. But that understanding came with grief, anger, and legal battles. Public outrage followed. Lawsuits were filed. Some victims received compensation, others only apologies. The scandal reignited debates about consent, ethics, and the treatment of vulnerable populations in state care. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated case. Similar abuses had happened in other institutions, hidden under the veil of authority and medical experimentation. The doctor died before he could face legal consequences. His confession arrived too late for many, but it cracked open a history that needed to be seen. Not as a footnote, but as a warning. His story served as a grim reminder that the pursuit of progress, when unchecked by ethics, can lead to atrocities, and that the most vulnerable among us, the voiceless, the institutionalized, the forgotten, are often the ones who pay the highest price. Even in silence, harm accumulates. But when the truth is finally spoken, it can begin the long, painful work of accountability. The call came from a hospice bed in 2016. The woman, once a forensic technician at a busy crime lab, was now dying of brain cancer. Her voice was soft, almost inaudible, but the words she spoke would send shockwaves through the legal system. She had a confession, not of a single mistake, but of a pattern of deception spanning 15 years. It had started with carelessness. Then it became a cover-up. Eventually, it was corruption. She had processed DNA evidence for hundreds of criminal cases. Overworked, underpaid, and burned out, she began to cut corners, skipping sterilization procedures, mislabeling samples, failing to run controls. When her mistakes began surfacing, she chose to hide them. She falsified documentation, adjusted test logs, and quietly sabotaged evidence to avoid being caught. Her deception became systemic. She contaminated samples intentionally. In some cases, she introduced DNA that would falsely implicate suspects. In others, she destroyed exculpatory evidence that could have freed innocent people. And each lie required another to stay hidden. She became an expert not just in forensic science, but in deceit. When she finally left the lab, she tried to leave her past behind. For 2 decades, she said nothing. But her illness changed that. As her body deteriorated, the weight of her actions, the lives she had damaged, became unbearable. She compiled a list of cases she had worked on, noting where she had altered or contaminated evidence. She provided it to defense attorneys, along with a detailed confession explaining how and why she had done what she did. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Investigators reopened hundreds of criminal cases. Convictions that had rested on her lab results were now suspect. Men and women who had spent years behind bars were re-examined. In dozens of cases, convictions were overturned. Innocent people walked free, some after serving more than a decade in prison for crimes they didn't commit. But the damage went both ways. In compromising the evidence, she had also allowed guilty people to escape justice. Some had reoffended, others had vanished. The contamination didn't just destroy lives, it shredded public trust in the criminal justice system. The lab's reputation was ruined. Every case handled during her tenure was now under scrutiny. Prosecutors scrambled to rebuild cases. Defense attorneys combed through files. Judges faced the uncomfortable task of deciding who might deserve a new trial and who had already suffered enough. The woman died shortly after her confession became public. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no official punishment. But for the wrongfully convicted, her words were both a lifeline and a scar. Freedom came, but so did the rage. Years stolen, families broken, futures altered. Her story became a case study in systemic failure, not just of one technician, but of a culture that allowed shortcuts, ignored warning signs, and failed to check its own power. In her final days, she chose truth, not out of heroism, but out of necessity. The truth didn't fix what was broken, but it exposed it, and sometimes that's the first step toward justice. Her confession forced a painful reckoning with science, with trust, and with the human cost of every shortcut that was ever taken in the name of speed or simplicity. He was 94 years old, frail and forgotten, in a quiet nursing home when he made a final request to speak to a journalist. What he shared would uncover a horror long buried beneath official history. Not a scandal, but a genocide. One that had been erased from textbooks, denied by leaders, and hidden behind decades of bureaucratic silence. The man had been a government official in a small, authoritarian country during the 1960s. His position was modest, a mid-level administrator, but it placed him close enough to power to see what was happening, and to help hide it. In that decade, amid civil unrest and economic hardship, a scapegoat was chosen. A minority ethnic group blamed for the nation's problems. Quietly, and then with brutal efficiency, the government initiated a campaign of elimination. The official term used in memos was stabilization, but what took place was systematic execution. Entire regions were sealed off. The military claimed they were rooting out rebels. In reality, they were massacring civilians. Families were pulled from their homes, led to makeshift camps, and never seen again. Over the course of several months, more than 100,000 people were killed. The man didn't participate in the killings, but he played a role in the cover-up, falsifying casualty reports, crafting public statements that blamed unrest on insurgents, and helping conceal the scale of what had occurred. He watched as journalists were blocked from entering affected areas, as mass graves were bulldozed and documents quietly destroyed. For more than 50 years, he remained silent. He believed at first that speaking out would cost him his life. Later, as the regime modernized and rebranded itself, he feared being prosecuted or shunned. But eventually, as death neared, he found himself unable to live with what he'd helped conceal. The journalist listened as he recounted names, places, dates, then set out to verify the story. Satellite imagery showed disturbed earth patterns exactly where the man described mass graves. Interviews with surviving family members confirmed what they had long suspected. Oral histories passed down in secret had spoken of disappearances, of villages erased, but no one had believed them. When the confession and supporting evidence were published, the world reacted with shock. International organizations demanded investigations. Under pressure, the government allowed limited excavations. What they found was undeniable: mass graves filled with bodies, many of them women and children, all from the same ethnic group. It was the confirmation of a genocide the world had never acknowledged. Survivors wept, not only for the dead, but for the decades of being silenced, ignored, disbelieved. The confession gave them something they'd been denied for generations: recognition. Proof that the atrocities their parents and grandparents described had been real. The official died just weeks after the interview. There were no charges filed, no sweeping political changes, but something had shifted. The silence had been broken. The truth was out. Incomplete, perhaps, and arriving too late for justice, but still, it was out. His confession revealed how easily history can be rewritten when those in power agree to forget, and how entire communities can be erased, not just through violence, but through omission. In the end, it wasn't an international tribunal or a whistleblower that exposed the genocide. It was a dying man, haunted by what he hadn't said, choosing, finally, to speak. She was 78 when she finally allowed herself to exhale. It was late evening in her modest living room, surrounded by family photographs and fading memories. Her daughter sat by her side, holding her hand, when the words came, hesitant at first, then flooding out. A deathbed confession, buried for more than 50 years, that would shake the foundations of 2 lives and challenge everything they thought they knew. In 1947, she had been a young nurse at a busy hospital. Exhausted, overwhelmed, and only a year into her career, she was working the overnight shift in the maternity ward. That night had been particularly chaotic: multiple births, understaffed, and no breaks in sight. Amid the noise and confusion, she made a mistake, one she recognized almost immediately, but couldn't bring herself to fix. She had accidentally switched 2 newborns after a routine examination. Their identification bracelets had slipped off during transport, and in the blur of her fatigue, she placed them back incorrectly. She realized the error a few hours later. The differences between the babies were small: a slightly darker shade of hair, a subtle birthmark, but enough for her to know. Panic set in. She thought about admitting it, but fear took over. Fear of losing her job, of lawsuits, of being blamed for something irreversible. So she said nothing. The babies were discharged to their respective families, and with that, 2 lives were sent down paths that were never meant to be theirs. For decades, she lived with the guilt. She tracked the children from a distance, watched one grow up in privilege, the other in modest means. She saw their families in newspaper clippings and heard local gossip. One became a doctor, the other worked with his hands. Neither knew they were living each other's lives. On her deathbed, she finally told the truth. She gave names, dates, everything. After her passing, her daughter, shaken but determined, reached out to the families involved. At first, no one believed it, but DNA testing confirmed what the nurse had said. The 2 men, now in their 50s, had indeed been raised by the wrong families. The revelation rocked everyone involved. The men had grown up believing in a version of themselves shaped by nurture, not nature. One suddenly realized he wasn't biologically related to the family he loved. The other met siblings who shared his blood, but none of his memories. Some tried to build relationships with their biological families. Others couldn't. The emotional weight was too heavy, the resentment too deep. What could you say to a mother you never knew? How do you relate to a brother who feels like a stranger? The confession sparked difficult conversations about identity, fate, and the role of chance in our lives. It also raised a painful question. Would it have been better not to know? There was no clear answer. The truth offered a kind of clarity, but also heartache. It dismantled the foundations of entire families, revealing that love alone could not undo the loss of what might have been. In the end, the nurse's confession was an act of courage, if delayed. She chose to speak, knowing it might cause pain, but believing the truth was worth telling. And maybe that's what these confessions all remind us, that even the smallest choices can echo through generations. And that truth, however late, has the power to rewrite the story. He had always been a quiet man, retired, gray-haired, and largely forgotten by the world. But in his final days, as cancer tightened its grip, he reached out to someone he trusted, a former colleague who now worked as a journalist. What he revealed would challenge the very idea of what history claims as truth. For years he had worked in a government office tied to the nation's intelligence services. Nothing glamorous. Paperwork, summaries, quiet meetings in windowless rooms. But in the early 1980s, he had witnessed something he could never unsee. Something that had haunted him ever since. A covert operation gone wrong, followed by a cover-up that erased lives. It started with surveillance. An informant had given them a lead about a group allegedly planning political violence. The order came down fast. Monitor, gather evidence, neutralize the threat. But the operation spiraled out of control. One night, acting on bad intelligence, agents stormed the wrong house. Inside were a family, mother, father, and 2 young children. Innocents, no weapons, no plans, just people living their lives. They were all killed, labeled as collateral damage in a necessary security action. Internally, it was understood to be a fatal error, but instead of accountability, the agency crafted a false report. They planted evidence, silenced witnesses, destroyed documentation, and the story was buried along with the bodies. The man who now lay dying hadn't been on the ground that night, but he helped write the memo that framed the family as dangerous radicals. He sat in the meeting where they decided what to say publicly. He watched as the lie became policy. For decades he tried to forget. He convinced himself that national security required difficult choices, that his role had been small. But the images never left him. Not the photos of the children, not the way his supervisor looked him in the eye and said, "We clean it up or we all go down." Now, with nothing left to protect and no fear of consequences, he spoke. The journalist took down everything, names, dates, documents still hidden in obscure archives. With careful investigation, the story began to take shape. Local death records, anonymous sources, even retired agents confirmed pieces of his confession. It was real. The article that followed didn't cause riots or bring down governments. But it forced a long overdue conversation. The families of the victims, who had always believed their loved ones were wrongly accused, were finally vindicated. Small as it may have seemed, it was a moment of truth in a history built on denial. The dying man didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. He simply said, "I should have spoken sooner, but I'm speaking now." His confession was one of complicity, of how good people allow bad things to happen when fear and loyalty outweigh conscience. He hadn't pulled a trigger or given an order, but he had helped shape the story that allowed others to live with what they'd done. In the end, his words became a reminder of something deeper, that history is not just written by victors, it's rewritten by silence. And that sometimes the truth doesn't scream. It whispers from the edge of death, hoping someone will listen. In the quiet hours between life and death, when fear begins to fade and the past looms largest, people sometimes choose to speak. Not because they expect forgiveness or even understanding, but because they need to unburden themselves before they leave. These deathbed confessions were not just last-minute admissions. They were turning points, not always for justice, but always for truth. We've heard the voices: the intelligence officer who revealed a second shooter, the nurse who accidentally switched newborns, the businessman with a second family, the forensic technician who sabotaged hundreds of cases, the veteran who helped cover up a wartime massacre. Each carried a secret for decades, often hidden beneath routine lives until time forced them to choose: die with the lie or let the truth breathe. Some of these revelations brought long-awaited closure. Others opened wounds that had scarred over. None were easy. Truth never is, especially when it arrives late. The cost of silence, years of wrongful imprisonment, generations of grief, erased identities, reminds us that what we bury doesn't disappear. It festers, waits, and eventually demands to be heard. There's something deeply human in this pattern. We avoid discomfort. We justify our silence. We convince ourselves the moment to speak will come, later, someday. But then life moves on, and silence calcifies, until something shatters it. Death, strangely, can be that something. With reputations no longer at risk, with no more lies to maintain, many finally find the courage to say what should have been said long ago. These aren't just stories about confessions. They're stories about timing, about what we're willing to protect and at what cost. But there's another layer. For every truth spoken at the end, how many went unspoken? How many secrets died with no warning, no closure, no reckoning? A sudden heart attack, a car crash, a breath that never came. How many stories vanished in those moments, stories that could have rewritten history, freed the innocent, or healed families? We'll never know. And maybe that's the most haunting part. These confessions, strange, painful, revelatory, ask something of us. They ask us to look at the stories we're told with fresh eyes, to question the clean, comfortable narratives, to remember that behind every official version of events, there are people, scared, fallible, and capable of immense regret. And they remind us that the truth doesn't always arrive when it's needed. Sometimes it shows up late, too late to save a life or prevent a tragedy, but just in time to change how we remember. So here we are at the end of these stories, not with tidy conclusions, but with a deeper awareness of how fragile truth can be, of how easily it can be buried, and of how powerful it can be, even whispered from a hospital bed. If there's one question that lingers, it's this: how many truths are still waiting to be told? And when the moment comes, will we have the courage to speak? That's the final echo of these confessions. Not judgment, not redemption, just the quiet, enduring power of truth. Spoken, at last, before the silence takes hold.